Fantasia has always been kind of the sacred monster of animators. Some of the animation in it is as perfect as animation has ever been.
The vision of Walt was always to have a series of Fantasias that would follow. In 1940, there was a document called Future Fantasias, which was proposing a lot of ideas for new sequences for Fantasia.
But when Fantasia was released, much to Walt's dismay, it didn't do as well as he thought, and the whole idea of doing it as a continuing piece kind of fell by the wayside.
But the concepts stayed alive for many, many years, and in the late 70s, some of the artists at the studio would actually start working on a new version of Fantasia called Musicana.
Two of the key artists working on Musicana were Mel Shaw and Willie Reitherman.
Mel Shaw had been the first artist doing development work on Bambi way back right after Snow White came out. He had been an integral part of the studio back in its glory days in the 30s and early 40s, and he had come back to Disney in, I think, 1975, and his original assignment was to do inspirational color pastels for a lot of the work that was in development at that time.
Mel Shaw was the development department before it was called the development department.
Mel had been exploring a million new ideas, and one of the ideas is create a more modern version of Fantasia. And he brought that idea to Willie Reitherman, and Willie loved the project.
Willie Reitherman was one of the 9 old men who had directed the dinosaur fight in Fantasia. He had animated Monstro and Pinocchio.
Musicana was kind of a follow-up on Fantasia, only we wanted it to be different. I had the idea of doing some shorts that would be from various countries with the musicians of that country.
When you walked into Mel's office, he had huge storyboards blanketed with pen and ink, pastel drawings. Basically, he had pretty much blocked out different sequences of Musicana.
I also had access to the music library, so anything I thought would fit, I would get it out and give them an idea of how I thought the music should be and so forth.
That's how Mel started building each of these pieces.
One sequence that Mel Shaw explored for Musicana is a sequence about jazz in the south of the U.S. The music would have been a song by Ella Fitzgerald and Louis Armstrong.
You have Louis Armstrong, who's a great, great artist, one of the founders of jazz in America, and you start to see this story come to life with frogs on lily pads pulling out their trumpets and handkerchiefs, and the whole party getting messed up at the end by a stern wheeler going by. All the frogs surfing waves into the shore, and it was really a Fantasia sequence in every way except a chance to take a hit off of a more modern, contemporary artist. Mel Shaw's an interesting artist. One of the styles that he brought to the studio was really unique. He worked in pastels, which are colored chalks, basically, and he would have a shop vac in one hand and take off some of the chalk with his shop vac and come in with another one and kind of draw on top of it and create these beautiful drawings. When you put it under a camera and you light it, so you have lights coming in from the side, the chalk absolutely glows. It gives you colors and luminance that you just don't get with a painting.
Mel Shaw was really a big fan of Ima Sumac,
who was a Peruvian soprano, really well known for hitting, I think, 4 or 5 octaves.
And he wanted to develop a whole sequence around one of her songs, using a lot of folklore from both the Aztecs and the Incas. The interesting thing about Ima Sumac is that Walt Disney himself had met Ima Sumac for the first time in 1941 during a trip he took to Latin America. Ima Sumac at that time was not even famous.
There were also notes for something that would be set in Africa.
The African piece was called The Wren God, and it told the story of a monkey that stole a diamond from the wren god. Most of the concept art was developed by Ken Anderson.
Ken was probably one of the most influential single artists at the studio all through his tenure from the 40s into the 60s.
Ken Anderson was like Mel Shaw. They both brought so much to each production. The way he drew the characters, even the animators took cues on the design.
One piece that looked very interesting was The Emperor's Nightingale, the Hans Christian Andersen story.
The Emperor's Nightingale would be the vehicle for Mickey Mouse, the way that the Sorcerer's Apprentice had been in Fantasia.
In this version, it would be Mickey Mouse who owned the real nightingale, the one that teaches the Emperor the value of the humble little brown bird versus the exquisite jeweled mechanical creation.
We don't really know what music would have been used for that sequence. What we know are the artists who worked on that sequence. It's none other than John Lasseter.
Lasseter impressed me. He showed that he had imagination and talent. So that's how he started to work on The Emperor and the Nightingale with me.
Another sequence that Mel Shaw was toying with for Musicana was based on Finlandia, which was composed in 1899 by John Sibelius.
They were going to do that as a battle between an ice god and a sun goddess. And their conflict would produce the myriad lakes that dot the Scandinavian landscape. And also, there were some sketches for an animated version of Alibaba.
Alibaba and the 40 Thieves comes from the Arabian Nights. The idea was to use the music Sherazade by Rimsky-Korsakov.
Mel would do a pastel, and then he would get his camera and he would shoot his master shot of the whole thing, then go in and shoot little individual pieces, close-up of one of the characters, then maybe another two-shot over here, and so forth. And he would take these slides, and then he would be able to tell you a story.
I remember going to a screening of Musicana, and by screening I mean it was kind of an early presentation. It was Mel with a tray of slides of his artwork that he had photographed. He would drop a needle on a vinyl record album, and he'd get this feeling of what the movie could be. I think that was the genius of Mel.
The studio was always happy to have 2 or 3 people developing projects. The studio was just unsure of whether they wanted to do another Fantasia-type feature. And they ultimately passed on the project.
Where you have a project that you love and put your life's blood into, as Mel and Wooly did, and it falls apart. It's devastating. And I think that's what eventually sent Wooly out the door.
Wooly knew it was sort of time for him to resign, and he did leave the studio in 1981 after having worked on Musicana.
Mel, on the other hand, was not deterred at all by the loss of Musicana. Mel was one of the very, very first artists on Beauty and the Beast, and did, once again, the most luscious drawings of Belle and the Beast and the castle, and that I can actually point to the movie and say, Mel Shaw designed that.
There's a saying at the Disney studio that good projects never die.
After every production, no matter how many thousands of drawings and illustrations, everything's kept and archived.
So Musicana kind of joins a very distinguished body of artwork by some of the great Disney artists of a work that began and never finished.
There was no question it was spectacular artwork. Whether the studio thought it was commercial is another question. I mean, it's like a great painting. It's timeless, and certainly the artwork from Musicana is timeless.